The party was held at the Swank Officers' Club, with practically all of the top officers on Rabaul in attendance. These included Vice Admirals Junichi Kusaka, Commander Southeast Area Fleet and 11th Air Fleet, and Tomoshige Samejima, 8th Fleet Commander. Great quantities of sake were served, and the party got really lively when several hostesses joined. These were the usual geisha girls assigned by the Navy Ministry to the major forward bases as morale boosters. Although the party was in my honour, I was still under a strain and was not enjoying it as much as the others. I just wanted to get drunk and kept drinking sake at a great rate. Kusaka made a speech praising Shigure, saying, "The life expectancy of Rabaul-based destroyers has averaged something under 2 months, yet one old ship has now fought steadily for almost 3 months without a scratch or the loss of a single member of her crew. Let's drink a toast to Captain Hara, Commander Yamagami, and all the men of the great Shigure." It dawned on me then why my mood was so dark. The party really ought to have been for my fine crew of 240 men instead of all the top brass. While I brooded about this, the party became quite boisterous, and then one of the staff officers spoke up. "Admiral Kusaka, I have long desired but never dared to ask certain questions. May I ask them now?" The room fell silent at this audacity, but Admiral Kusaka nodded, and the young man continued. "You have just noted the brief life expectancy of a destroyer. Must we put up with such a situation? Why do all our big ships just sit at Truk? Are we going to celebrate next October 26 as the anniversary of the last battle in history in which our carriers took part? During the past year, our destroyers have not only been conducting their unglamorous transport missions, but they have also been bearing the full brunt of all actions in these waters. Forgive my rudeness. This is no criticism of you, but we all know that your 11th Air Fleet has been shore-based since the start of the war. In this critical theatre, why do destroyers have to shoulder the entire burden without the support of our carriers, battleships and cruisers?" This rambling series of questions was far more than had been expected, but it expressed the feelings of most in the crowded room. There was awe-stricken silence as the full impertinence of the drunken officer struck his more inhibited colleagues. Kusaka was glumly silent. Admiral Samejima broke the mounting tenseness. "I understand that Commander-in-Chief Koga is preparing for a decisive naval action in which all our big ships will be deployed." The young officer shouted uncontrollably, "When? When are these ships going to do something? They have been out of action for a full year, and that year has been like a century for our destroyers. In this time the enemy has caught up and surpassed us." A fellow officer tried to quiet his friend, suggesting that it was late and time to go home, but the drunken harangue continued. "And what is Imperial Headquarters doing in Tokyo? Announcements blare every day that we are bleeding the enemy white in the Solomons. It is we who are being bled white, not the enemy." 2 friends carried and dragged him from the room while he burst into tears and sobbed, "Yugumo is sunk. Poor Yugumo is sunk with so many of my friends." The episode had a strange effect on me. I too was drunk, but managed to stagger to my feet, clutching the long ceremonial sword which Admiral Samejima had just presented to me. I walked over to him and said, "I wish to return this sword, Admiral, because I do not deserve it. Even if I did deserve it, what use is a sword on board ship?" While everyone gasped in astonishment at my outburst, Captain Miyazaki recovered quickly from his shock and came to my side, saying, "You are tired, Hara. Let us go home and get some rest." I waved him aside with, "No, thank you, Miyazaki," and continued, "I want to exchange this sword for my wonderful crew. They are the ones who should be rewarded, not me. Admiral Samejima, buy drinks for my men." With this, Admiral Ijuin, my own commanding officer, came to my side and tried to cajole me. "All right, Hara, I'll buy drinks for your men, but now we are all tired and it is time to turn in." I awakened next morning with a terrible hangover. Commander Yamagami woefully recounted how the other officer and I had made spectacles of ourselves, and how Ijuin and Miyazaki had dragged me bellowing from the party. Such behaviour by ranking officers was unheard of in the Imperial Navy, and dire misgivings added to my discomfort from overindulgence. Curiously, I was never rebuked for my misconduct. I later learned that when news of my performance spread to the enlisted men, it boosted my popularity with them. The fact that nothing happened to me would seem to indicate that my superior officers shared the general dissatisfaction with the High Command. Naval headquarters in Tokyo had ordered our withdrawal to Bougainville as the final defensive line. This did not encourage optimism in the combat area. Bougainville is almost 3 times the size of Guadalcanal. Its long coastline, largely unexplored, offered many potential landing spots for the enemy. The occasional discovery of American ration boxes scattered in the jungle made it clear that enemy operatives on the island were selecting the best invasion sites. Combined Fleet headquarters at Truk did nothing to add to our peace of mind. Our new top commanders were no better than their predecessors. Admiral Minechi Koga, who had succeeded to overall command upon Yamamoto's death in April 1943, had done practically nothing. No great victories had been achieved by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa since he had replaced Nagumo as Carrier Force Commander in November 1942, and Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, ailing and weary of his Second Fleet Command, had just been relieved by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita in August 1943. These 3 new commanders worked diligently and hard, but they could not work miracles. The basic defect was in Tokyo, where Imperial Naval Headquarters was still run by Admiral Osami Nagano. Half a year had passed since the death of Yamamoto, and yet his policies were still being followed. In the Java Sea Battle of February 1942, I had learned that combat teaches more lessons than 1,000 exercises. Unfortunately, the commanding admirals did not share this view. They kept Japan's main naval strength at Rabaul or, still worse, in homeland waters, to conserve the ships and train the men. The result was that both ships and men proved unfit when they were finally forced into action. The aggressive enemy took no pause. We had scarcely returned from our triumph at Vella Gulf when we were made acutely aware of how critical the situation really was. On October 12th, a record raid of 349 land-based planes swarmed over Rabaul. The high-altitude bombing was not very accurate, however, and only 1 transport was sunk. So huge a raid on a main Japanese base was very impressive, and it shocked Truk headquarters. But Admiral Koga still wavered. If the enemy could fly so many land-based planes against Rabaul, the Solomons was not a favourable stage for a fleet engagement. Another large-scale air assault was made on October 18th against Rabaul and Buin, the main air base on Bougainville. Koga at last ordered 2 heavy cruisers and a squadron of destroyers to go from Truk to Rabaul. This followed the familiar Yamamoto pattern of piecemeal reinforcement. It was a move which Koga would have cause to regret. Air assaults in strength were resumed 5 days later and continued daily until Buin lay in ruins. Meanwhile, the surface units arrived at Rabaul on October 21st. Among the newcomer destroyers was Shiratsuyu, which had been on detached duty, and now rejoined my command. I was elated, finally, to be in charge of 3 ships, 6 months after my appointment as a division commander. In those days, very few Japanese destroyer divisions actually had as many as 3 ships. Shiratsuyu, 1,180 tons, was a sister ship of Shigura and Samidare. Although built in 1933, she had the appearance of being brand new. She had been badly damaged by enemy bombs near Buna, New Guinea, in November 1942, and had to be practically rebuilt at Kure. In spite of my elation, I was apprehensive about this ship. She was manned almost completely by inexperienced sailors, and I doubted that Shiratsuyu would prove much of an asset to my division. On October 23rd, I took my 3 ships on a transport mission to Iboki, about 50 miles east of Cape Gloucester. The first of a series of daily air raids hit Rabaul and Buin that day, but enemy planes still gave my ships a warm reception during the dark of morning. My destroyers scattered to run independently, and the planes gave up the chase at daybreak. My ships reassembled in good order, and I was relieved to find all three intact. Shiratsuyu showed more promise than I had anticipated. 6 days later, I took Shigur and Shiratsuyu on a transport assignment to Garove Island, north of Wilaumes Peninsula. A few enemy planes made passes at us, but no heavy action was involved. Nevertheless, Shiratsuyu performed so well that I decided she was an asset to the division. How wrong I was. Meanwhile, on October 27th, the enemy made another landing, this time on Mono Island, a small base 20 miles south of Bougainville. The following day, enemy paratroops fell upon Choiseul, and Admiral Koga realized that the time had come for a showdown, whether he liked it or not. Imperial headquarters demanded that he hold Bougainville until October 30th, at all cost. Koga immediately ordered Ozawa's 3 carriers, with their 173 planes, to Rabaul. At the same time, he ordered Rabaul to mount a full-scale counter-offensive around Bougainville. But the American timetable was not waiting for Koga. Carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Zuiho were still far north of Rabaul when powerful enemy forces invaded Cape Torokina on the western coast of central Bougainville. The invasion, which commenced at 700 on the first day of November, was practically unopposed. Admiral Kusaka rushed all the planes of his 11th Air Fleet to Torokina, but these 104 fighters and 16 bombers were unable to stem the enemy tide which flooded onto the island. Ozawa's 3 carriers, concerned primarily with their own safety, launched their 173 planes while still 200 miles north of Rabaul. Admiral Koga, at Truk, wanted to avoid the mistakes of 15 months earlier, when the enemy had landed at Guadalcanal. On that occasion, Admiral Mikawa led his 7 ships to a phenomenal victory, but he failed to sink any of the enemy's transports. Accordingly, the decision was now made to throw all available ships at Torokina and follow up with a convoy of troop-laden transports for a counter-landing. Koga appointed Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori to command the operation. Omori, newly arrived at Rabaul, had been in the homeland or at Truk for many months with his 2 12,374-ton cruisers, Miyoko and Haguro. Yet in this operation, Omori was expected to outdo Mikawa's Guadalcanal feat. That is, he was to wipe out enemy transports in addition to sinking warships. Omori's 2 heavy cruisers were supported by 2 screening units. The left flank, consisting of Ijuin's light cruiser Sendai, 5,595 tons, and my 3 destroyers, was the only combat-seasoned element of the formation. The right flank screen under Rear Admiral Hiroshi Matsubara in light cruiser Agano, 7,170 tons, included destroyers Naganami, Hatsukaze, and Wakatsuki. None of these ships had ever operated together before, and Matsubara was inexperienced in night battle. In a short briefing conference held in flagship Miyoko's gun room, Admiral Omori said, "We have never teamed together before, and this can be a serious detriment in battle. But Admiral Mikawa managed without a previously trained team, and so can we. I have firm trust and faith in the skill of each of you commanding officers and in the ability of your men. I believe we shall win." As the meeting broke up, Ijuin tapped my shoulder. "Hara," he said, "this will be a tough one. I shall be relying on you." I laughed. "Let's be prepared for a swim and take along plenty of shark repellent." But I saw at once that Ijuin was in no mood for a joke. He mumbled glumly, "I do not like cruiser Sendai. She is now 9 years old and so sluggish." I know what he meant. He had not used this cruiser in many months, although she was flagship of his destroyer Squadron 3. He preferred to sail in destroyers. Ijuin added, "But then Sendai is younger than your Shigur. I am uneasy about this operation and hope that the ships from Truk will do a fine job. Their crews, though inexperienced, are young and fresh. They are not as tired as we are." We walked in silence to the ramp where Ijuin offered his hand and said, Brooding will do us no good, Hara. We must fight and fight desperately. Japan will topple if Bougainville falls. Returning to Shigure, I could not keep from brooding. I did not understand how Omori could have been selected to lead such an important operation as this one. Until recently, he had been instructing in tactics at the torpedo school, and had never been in a major naval action. Our 10 warships steamed out of Rabaul at 15:20 on November 3rd. Immediately clear of the harbour, we went into regular cruising formation with Ijuin's Sendai, followed by my destroyers, Shigure, Samidare, Shiratsuyu, in a tight single column to the left and slightly ahead of Miyoko and Haguro. On the right flank of these heavy cruisers was Admiral Matsubara's light cruiser Agano, followed in column by destroyers Naganami, Hatsukaze, and Wakatsuki. The convoy of 5 troop-filled transports and their 5 destroyer escorts followed at a distance of several miles. The day was cool but drizzly and murky, and visibility was limited. Beneath a mild southeasterly breeze, the sea was calm. Our force had no more than cleared St. George Channel when our radios began picking up nearby enemy transmissions. We could see nothing, but it was evident that radar-equipped scout planes had spotted us from above the clouds. At 19:45, one of the SB-24s broke through the clouds to make several bombing runs on Sendai, but it scored no hits. By this time, our own scout planes were reporting on the enemy situation to the south. 3 battleships, many cruisers and destroyers at Empress Augusta Bay near Torokina. This was much greater strength than we had anticipated. The enemy seemed to be ready and waiting for us. Omori consulted with Rabaul headquarters, where at 21:30 Admiral Kusaka ordered the transports to turn back. He concluded that a counter-landing in the face of such a strong enemy deployment was impossible. But he told Omori to go ahead with his force and sink enemy ships. The 10 ships in their 3 columns continued through the steady drizzle, which limited visibility to 5,000 metres. I was in the column nearest to Bougainville, but could discern nothing along that black coastline. I thought of how closely this resembled the situation at Vella Gulf on August 6th, and how disastrously that had turned out. Our speed of advance continued at 18 knots, while I brooded about our blind left side. Enemy ships, with their all-seeing radar, could use the darkness as a perfect cloak and attack us at will. At 23:24, another SB-24 swooped out of the darkness to drop bombs at Haguro, but again no hits. The enemy was keeping close track of where we were and where we were going. When this attack ended, Haguro catapulted a scout plane which reported 14 minutes later. 1 cruiser and 3 destroyers spotted 50 miles, 330 degrees from Cape Mutupina. The indicated position was only 20 miles south of our formation. Omori ordered the plane to search for other enemy ships and put his formation into a simultaneous turnabout to mark time while awaiting a further report on enemy ships. The 10 ships, maintaining their tight formation, turned 180 degrees, steamed about 10,000 metres, and turned again to resume their southward course. This manoeuvre worked well in throwing the enemy off his timing in 1942, when he had to rely on sighting reports. But the manoeuvre was ineffective in 1943 against an enemy continuously and accurately informed by radar. During the turnaround, we eagerly awaited further reports from our scout planes, but none came. We had not the slightest idea that Admiral Merrill's force of 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers, fully informed of our approach, was rushing northward at that very moment to oppose us. At 25 minutes past midnight, as we were resuming course after the second turnaround, I saw a dim red flare in the sky ahead. The bearing of this light, 70 degrees to port, jibed with the position of the enemy force reported by the Haguro plane. The flare was so dim that I estimated the distance to be about 20,000 metres. It disappeared after 2 or 3 seconds. I continued to look for it during precious minutes in which other factors were ignored. This was my mistake. Had I looked nearer at hand at this time, I would have seen our own formation in disorder and dangerously jammed together, as a result of the complex turns we had just completed. Samidar was out of column to starboard, and our other 3 ships had closed to within 300 metres distance instead of the prescribed 500 metres. I decided that the flare had been dropped by one of our scout planes to mark the enemy's position. I dictated an urgent message to all ships. Enemy sighted 70 degrees to port, and ordered it prepared for immediate transmission upon my next instruction. Not a soul in our force even dreamed that the main enemy force was approaching from the south and was at that moment directly ahead of our position. When my lookout called out, 4 ships, 70 degrees to port, I told the radio men to send my prearranged message. It was then 0045 hours of November 2nd. It was my judgment that the 4 ships had continued straight ahead from the position indicated by the first dim flare. Actually, 4 of the 8 American destroyers had swerved from their south to north movement while I was peering toward the dim flare. They reappeared to us only after completing their turn to launch torpedoes. My lookout reported, "The enemy force has split into 2 groups, one going away, the other paralleling our course. They are destroyers, distant 7,000 metres." I shuddered at the realization that they must already have released torpedoes. The initiative was in the hands of the enemy. In that instant, I yelled 2 orders. "Launch torpedoes! Hard right rudder!" There was a prompt response, and Shigure started a right turn as her 8 torpedoes plopped into the water at 2-second intervals. I watched more calmly then, satisfied that we would be able to evade any torpedoes the 4 enemy destroyers might have fired before they split up. Turning from watching our own torpedoes for a moment, I was petrified to see Sendai heading straight for my ship. Simultaneously with Shigure, the cruiser had also turned right, but in an exceptionally fast and violent manner. I paled to see how close she was. This huge cruiser, nearly 3 times the size of Shigure, was coming head-on for our port side. "Full starboard helm," I screamed. "Full speed." Icy sweat coursed down my back at the swift approach of Sendai's hulk. I held my breath, like a drowning man as I watched the approach of her towering bows, and felt the snake-like pace of Shigure's evasive effort. I braced for the impact of collision as Shigure's frail stern passed within 10 feet of the speeding cruiser. With the danger past, I turned anxious eyes towards Samidare and froze again in anxiety. This following cruiser, turning sharply right to avoid Sendai's crazy rush, sideswiped Shiratsuyu last in line. Her portside hull and deck crumpled under the impact of Samidar's hull, and in that instant all of her guns and torpedo tubes were smashed beyond use. Newcomer Shiratsuyu had proved she was no asset to my division. But most shocking to me at that moment was Sendai's sudden turn without notice to our following ships. Aghast at the unexpected response of his ship, Ijuin ordered the helm reversed, and I watched Sendai swing back to the left immediately after she had so narrowly missed hitting Shigure. One moment I sighed with relief, and in the next instant caught my breath as I saw a flight of falling shells, one of which hit full amidship into Sendai. The cruiser, in its erratic movements, had walked into the very first salvo from the American cruisers. I had never seen such spectacular accuracy. A first salvo hit. Second and third salvos also struck the fated cruiser with fantastic precision, and she flamed like a giant torch. Her vitals smashed, the ship staggered and slowed, but managed still to clear 8 of her torpedoes in the general direction of the bombarding ships. The huge flames from Sendai, 500 metres distant, blinded me from seeing the source of the enemy shells, but Samidar, 500 metres farther away, was able to judge the position of the enemy ships. Her seasoned skipper, Lieutenant Commander Yoshiro Sugihara, released a brace of 8 torpedoes at 0052. The 4 unseen American cruisers were then 15,000 metres away. They made an all-ships-right manoeuvre at 0051 and successfully evaded the 16 long-range torpedoes. Destroyer Foot, however, the last ship of the second American destroyer column, turned erratically into the course of a torpedo at 0108. She was put out of action but did not sink. I was suddenly overjoyed when, at 0052, a lookout announced that Shigure's torpedoes had accounted for 2 enemy destroyers. Actually, the separation of the enemy's 4-destroyer group was a maneuver unknown in the Imperial Navy. We thought 2 of them were closing in a hyperbola to parallel our own course, and so wrote them off when they failed to appear in the position we had anticipated. Instead, they were all running in the same direction, away from our course. This novel American tactic created an illusion that was deceptively effective. The jubilation raised in my destroyers was thus entirely unwarranted. Meanwhile, chaos and consternation reigned in the 2 other Japanese columns. Admiral Omori could see no enemy ships at the time of my 0045 sighting report. 5 minutes later, he saw Sendai erupt in flames. She was supposed to be at least 1,000 meters ahead and on course parallel to his Miyoko. Instead, he found her burning on his port beam. Omori knew then he had been taken by surprise. His reaction, influenced by the conservation idea so prevalent in command circles, was to adjust his formation to its original deployment, and he ordered a turnabout. This action has been widely criticized, but Omori has never seen fit to discuss it. The turnabout might have worked if all ships had responded properly, but 2 of the columns were manned by officers inexperienced in night action, and the result was chaos. Admiral Matsubara's 3rd column made a further blunder. Although he lacked battle experience, Matsubara was known for his dogged aggressiveness. On hearing my sighting report, he put his column into a full-speed dash to engage the enemy. He continued thus for 10 minutes without result. When he finally saw the turn made by heavy cruisers Miyoko and Haguro, he put his own ships into the awkward movement, committing the most serious error of the night. When cruiser Agano and her 3 following destroyers had headed north after completing their turn, Matsubara did not notice that his column was crossing the course of Omori's Miyoko and Haguro at a right angle. The result was that 12,374-ton Miyoko, crossing in front of Hatsukaze, 3rd ship of the Matsubara column, brushed the tender nose of that 2,500-ton destroyer. The 2 following ships, Haguro and Wakatsuki, barely avoided making it a quadruple collision. Panic-stricken, Matsubara again circled to get back to his crippled destroyer. A quick survey was enough to convince him that nothing could be done for her in the height of battle, and he turned again to withdraw on a course parallel to that of the 2 heavy cruisers. At 01:15, American shells straddled Miyoko and Haguro, and the cruisers opened fire blindly with their big guns, in the general direction of the enemy. In the next few minutes they also released a total of 24 torpedoes, which were entirely wasted. Enemy radar had wrested from the Japanese Navy its former supremacy in night action. While Omori and Matsubara were experiencing these travails, I was suffering agonies of my own. We were standing by burning Sendai, which had stopped dead. The enemy bombardment continued to batter the crippled ship so incessantly that Shigure could not close for rescue operations. I watched glumly as Samidar and Shiratsuyu received Omori's approval to withdraw. The American destroyers had done a very effective job, even though their 10 torpedoes had missed. 3 Japanese warships had been put out of action at one stroke. My bridge lookout noted a distress call from Sendai's stern lamp, which blinked. "Shigure, approach me. Shigure, approach me. Shigure, approach me." My ship was still 500 meters on Sendai's starboard beam. No enemy shells had reached us, though they continued to cascade onto the stricken cruiser. My best friend, Ijuin, was pleading for help, and yet Shigure would not have a chance in approaching that inferno. I stood frozen on the bridge. Still vivid in my mind was the year-old memory of losing 43 Amatsukaze men when we drew concentrated fire from cruiser Helena as a result of my error. I had pledged to the spirit of those men not to repeat such a mistake. Shigure's skipper yelled impatiently, "Let's go, Captain Hara. Let's approach Sendai. The squadron commander has given us an order." Commander Yamagami's imploring tone and words had an effect on me contrary to what he had expected. Casting indecision aside, I replied, "No, Yamagami, I have decided not to. If we go to Sendai's aid, we too will be pinned down by enemy gunfire. We might take off a few crewmen, but all of us would perish." "But we have orders!" Yamagami shouted heatedly. "Orders! You are right," I thundered. "And let's get on with them. Our primary orders are to strike at the enemy. In battle rescue is always secondary. Let's go." "But our friends are asking for help," pleaded Yamagami. "They are dying before our eyes." This angered me, and I roared, "Shut up! This is no place for sentiment or debate. This is my responsibility. Don't interfere with authority." Yamagami was stunned into silence, and I gave ship orders. "Port helm, full speed ahead. We attack." Shigure's engine roared up to her maximum speed of 30 knots. It was my thought to join with any other ships still capable of fighting and strike back at the enemy. But neither Omori nor Matsubara had notified me of their movements, and I was unable to find them. When no friendly forces appeared, I spent 10 minutes in frantic search of targets. I then tried to find targets by following gunfire traces, but this did not work. Shigure advanced on a southerly course until Irawo 134, when we got Omori's withdrawal order and returned to Rabaul. Omori decided to break off because he believed we were fighting a 2-column force consisting of 7 cruisers and 9 destroyers, and that they were heading south on a course parallel to his own. This misjudgment stemmed from early reports of the enemy formation and the erroneous report by the spotter plane. The 2 Japanese heavy cruisers fought a mirage which existed only in the minds of their commanders. The 4 American cruisers had turned from their southerly course at Iro 101 and headed north. This resulted in the illusion that Omori had sunk 1 cruiser instantaneously and damaged 2 others. So Omori did not realize that his ships had been groping about like blind men, simply wasting ammunition and fuel. My heart was heavy as Shigure followed sluggishly after the 5 fast ships. Looking in the direction where we had last seen Sendai, I felt miserable. Thinking of the sideswiping which had put Samidare and Shiratsuyu out of action, I realized that some of the enemy ships must have gone in hot pursuit of those cripples and could only hope for the best. In the silence of Shigure's bridge, the men about me shared my lugubrious thoughts. On our way north, I thought of Admiral Koki Abe's distressing return from Guadalcanal. The tactics employed by Abe on that occasion had been sharply criticized ever since, and here, more than a year later, Omori had repeated the same errors. Both admirals had adopted and clung to a complex formation, failing to shift to a combat deployment when engaging the enemy. In Abe's case, we were fortunate that the enemy had outblundered us, but against Omori, the Americans no longer blundered. When I had brought a Matsukaze back, it was with 43 of my crew dead and the ship severely damaged. Now Shigure was intact and had suffered no casualties. It was some slight solace to think that I at least had not repeated my mistakes. This reminded me that Samidare, too, had survived the Abe sortie of a year ago, and I cheered up at the thought that this combat-seasoned destroyer would pull through this time as well. About Shiratsuyu, on the other hand, my thoughts were considerably gloomier. Had she not sideswiped Samidare, I felt sure that my 3 ships could have confused the enemy, just as I had done at Guadalcanal in the Abe sortie. The 4 destroyers which had just stormed us were not as skillful as the ones I had opposed at Vella Gulf on August 6, 1943. Here, despite the enemy's absolute advantage, all their torpedoes missed, and by so big a margin that none of us even saw them pass. From the vantage point of hindsight, I know that in this battle the advantage lay with the American force. There was not the slightest chance for a Japan victory. But I know, too, that we could have done better than we did. Ijuin was responsible for the debacle that befell his column. He was a tired, weary, and exhausted man, and, with the loss of cruiser Yugumo a month earlier, he had lost confidence in his own ability. An aristocrat often breaks down quickly in the face of adversity. Still greater responsibility rests with Admiral Omori. His turnabout in the face of the enemy served to tie Ijuin's hands, severely limiting his possible courses of action. On the other side of the picture, the Americans do not seem to have fought very brilliantly in this battle. They could have sunk many more Japanese ships if they had not been satisfied with just finishing off the two cripples. I do not understand why their spectacular bombardment of Sendai was not repeated against the other Japanese ships which lay in such confusion. These are thoughts that have occurred to me in the years since this battle. As Shigur returned to Rabaul that day, I had more immediate concerns. The engines were acting up, probably as a result of her having run at full speed for almost an hour during the battle. The Rabaul mechanics were apparently quite right when they had recommended her complete overhaul in the homeland. The high-speed run had been too much for her, and we now had to reduce speed to 18 knots. Somehow, this did not disturb me. Perhaps my anger at the outcome of the action made me hope that some enemy ships would catch up with us so that Shigur could engage them and show the kind of stuff we were made of. Nevertheless, I radioed our situation to Admiral Omori, adding a request that he arrange for the rescue of Sendai's survivors. Omori replied promptly, "We are slowing to 12 knots so that you may catch up. I have already asked Rabaul for a submarine to pick up crews of Sendai and Hatsukaze." At his reply, I grinned for the first time in many hours. It was so typical of his conscientiousness. Shigura joined Miyoko, her engines functioning well at the reduced speed, and we reached Rabaul at 2000 on November 2nd. I was relieved to find that my two other destroyers had made it to Simpson Harbour. All things considered, Shiratsuyu was in fair shape, but Samidare was badly beaten up. As soon as Samidare sighted Shigur, she signalled a report of her actions. Starting at OR 154, she had engaged enemy destroyers in a running battle which lasted for an hour. 5 men were killed and 5 injured by 2 direct hits, which also knocked out her steering control. She made it back to Rabaul by hand steering. Her skipper concluded, "We returned gunfire and launched 6 torpedoes at the enemy, and believe we inflicted as much damage as we received." Shiratsuyu expressed regret for the sideswiping and delighted us all in Shigure with a closing remark. Our withdrawal was easy. Enemy gunfire simply failed to catch up with us. A message from Mayoko brought mixed relief and sorrow. Submarine I-104 reports the rescue of Admiral Ijuin and 37 others from Sendai, but none from Hatsukaze. Early next morning, Shigur's skipper suggested that we visit Miyoko to deliver a full report to Admiral Omori. I said, "We can do that later, Yamagami. It would not be wise to leave our ship right now. Rabaul is no longer a safe place. The enemy will probably send a heavy air attack today, and we must be ready for them. Prepare Shigur for an all-out aerial attack." American planes had struck Rabaul 4 times in the past week. When November 3rd broke clear, I had a strong hunch that they would return this day. With this in mind, I also instructed Samidare and Shiratsuyu to prepare as best they could. All my crews worked feverishly, and it was well they did. The enemy came, and in strength, approaching from the north at a height of no more than 50 metres over the water. Previous attacks on Rabaul had all been made from high altitude, but the tactics were changed this day. The ensuing battle was the most spectacular action of my life. Shigure was the first ship to get underway, closely followed by Samidare and Shiratsuyu. All guns were pointed skyward when the first wave of planes came in, and the gun crews worked like fury. They fired everything without pause, seeming to vent the general anger pent up after our unhappy return from Empress Augusta Bay. A total of 80 B-25 bombers and 80 P-38 fighters hit Rabaul that day, and most of them skimmed past the masts of my destroyers. 3 little ships speeding out of the harbour must have been something that the American pilots and bombardiers had failed to reckon with. The American bombardiers were not ready or perhaps disdained to use their bombs on our small ships. Few bombs were directed at our ships, Shiratsuyu being the only one damaged, and then but slightly by a near miss. On the other hand, our guns were telling. The enemy formations were shredded as they passed us. Considering the size of his effort, the enemy achieved very poor results with that raid. It netted 18 Japanese planes destroyed, and only 2 small merchant ships and 1 subchaser sunk. For these minor spoils, the Americans paid with 8 B-25s and 9 P-38s definitely shot down, and many more planes which limped back to base with wings and fuselage so badly riddled that they crashed on landing. Gunfire from surface ships is usually of little effect against fast airplanes, but it was different that day. The enemy planes practically flew right into our gunfire. I saw at least 5 planes knocked down by Shiger. When my destroyers returned to Rabaul shortly after noon, every man of the crews was justifiably proud and jubilant. The depressed mood of the morning was completely gone. Officers and men alike were able to joke and laugh again. In the late afternoon, I went on board flagship Myoko, feeling a little easier about the unpleasant duty of reporting on the Empress Augusta Bay battle. Admiral Omori greeted me warmly as usual. After listening to the details of my report on the activities of the Ijuin group, he spoke reassuringly. "I think you did the right thing. You were correct in moving away from Sendai while she was under concentrated attack. On another score, I wish to thank you for the radio message of 0045, reporting your discovery of the enemy ships. No one else had then seen the ships. Without your sighting report, our whole group would have had a much worse time of it." When I asked permission to leave and turned toward the door, Admiral Omori called me back. He pulled out his wallet and emptied it on the desk. "Here's 30 yen, $15, he grinned. "It isn't much, but take it along as my token toward buying drinks for your men." I must have looked startled at this, for he laughed. Then we shook hands and laughed together. The episode of my returning the sword and requesting money for drinks in its place must have reached his ears, though it had occurred before he ever came to Rabaul. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay ended in a very one-sided victory for the United States. Destroyer Foot, which took a Samidar torpedo, was badly damaged but managed to get home. In this important action, the Americans lost fewer than 40 men killed and injured. Japan lost light cruiser Sendai and 335 men of her crew, and destroyer Hatsukaze with her entire crew of 240. Direct hits on heavy cruisers Myoko and Haguro and destroyer Samidare did some damage to these ships, but resulted in total casualties of only 6 men killed and 7 injured. Omori was shortly relieved of his command and returned to the torpedo school as its superintendent. Matsubara was also relieved of his post and assigned to shore duty. Submarine I-104 arrived in Rabaul on November 3rd with Sendai survivors, and I was on hand to greet them. Admiral Ijuin was a pitiful sight as he staggered onto the pier. I approached him with apologies for my failure to come to his aid. He responded with great feeling. "Don't say that, Hara. I am ashamed of my behaviour. Never mention an apology for that again." I was a coward. "You did the right thing. I must have been out of my mind." Soon afterward, Ijuin was returned to Tokyo. After a few months of rest, he came back to the South Pacific and fought valiantly. On May 24, 1944, he was killed while escorting a convoy when his flagship, frigate Iki, was torpedoed and sunk by United States submarine Raton. If the fighting ability of Rear Admiral Matsuji Ijuin was open to any doubt, his prediction that Japan would topple after the loss of Bougainville proved to be spectacularly accurate. Rabaul weathered the November 2nd air attack with little loss, but suffered a disaster 3 days later. Americans think of the Pearl Harbor attack as a catastrophe, but the November 5th air attack on Rabaul was far worse. A fleet of cruisers, zealously conserved for more than a year, was put out of action in a single day. How could such a thing happen? The Rabaul debacle of November 5th was an immediate outgrowth of the nightmarish battle of Empress Augusta Bay. Battle lessons that should have been learned were ignored. Errors were repeated until they became fatal. Japan should have realized the inadequacy of its reconnaissance efforts, Not only were too few planes allocated for search purposes, but pilot proficiency fell as the more skilled flyers were lost in combat. The High Command must have been aware of this, but the situation was not corrected. If our battle reports of the Empress Augusta Bay action tended to deceive the High Command, we were not entirely to blame. Other factors added to the deception. Submarine I-104, in accounting for its rescue of the Sendai survivors, stated, "We saw many enemy seaplanes and surface ships busily engaged in rescue operations, indicating that a number of enemy ships were sunk in the battle." Our delayed transport convey left Rabaul November 2nd, escorted by only 4 destroyers, and succeeded in landing 930 troops at Torokina. The convoy commander reported happily, "We met no surface opposition. The enemy fleet was obviously mending the wounds it had received from the Omori force." The fact is, however, that the Americans had chosen to trap the army troops after they had landed, and did so quite effectively. But that was an army problem, and the Japanese Navy could not be bothered with it. The illusory scores claimed by the Omori force were thus substantiated. Accordingly, when Omori returned to Tokyo after the operation, he suffered no disgrace. Instead, he was promoted to Vice Admiral and reassigned to the Torpedo School as its superintendent. Admiral Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, accepted Omori's report at face value. He felt that patient waiting had paid off and that his chance had come for a showdown with the enemy in the Solomons. It was on this basis that on November 3rd he ordered 7 cruisers south from Truk. Neither Koga nor any of his staff had been in combat recently with the increasingly powerful enemy. Consequently, complacence reigned. Admiral Kusaka at Rabaul was disturbed when he heard of the plan to send the cruisers, and he tried to discourage the idea. But he could not explain his skepticism of Omori's claims or his general uneasiness in terms convincing and meaningful to Koga. And so the cruiser fleet came south, under constant surveillance by American scout planes. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had replaced Kondo as Second Fleet Commander, shared Koga's complacence. He had heard much about the recent intense bombings of Rabaul, which failed to score a single direct hit on a warship. It was more than a year since Kurita had been in battle. The Japanese fighters he remembered were those of 1942, when Japan still boasted clear superiority over America in plane performance and pilot skill. His confidence of those days persisted, but now it was without foundation. Kurita's force arrived at Rabaul's Simpson Bay early in the morning of November 5th. I gaped as flagship Otago nonchalantly dropped anchor in the narrow harbour, now jammed with 7 cruisers and some 40 auxiliary ships. These new arrivals made me apprehensive and uneasy. At 700 that same morning, a patrol plane reported an enemy force of 5 heavy cruisers, 7 destroyers, and 2 transports in position 150 miles distant, bearing 140 degrees from Cape St. George. Rabaul headquarters concluded that these ships presaged a landing attempt. Reactions were casual since staff officers had become accustomed to enemy landing operations in recent months. No one at Rabaul dreamed that the 2 transports were aircraft carriers, Saratoga and Princeton. Japanese flyers had not seen American carriers for many months. Even the crack pilots of the Coral Sea battle in May 1942 had trouble recognizing American carriers. But no one at Rabaul remembered that. Kusaka ordered other scout planes to scramble and shadow the American movements. They scrambled, but they could not locate the task force in time to do any good. Air raid alarms in Rabaul were not sounded until Loi 900. My Shigure, already standing by, was underway rapidly and weaved out of the harbour amid many ships still at anchor. The big cruisers were still weighing anchor when the carrier planes stormed the base at 09:15. Some 50 Japanese ships were sitting ducks to the 23 Avenger torpedo planes, 22 Dauntless bombers, and 42 Hellcat fighters. Some 70 Zero fighters were airborne, but they could not stop the torrential rain of American bombs. While steaming out, Shigure opened up with all guns at the swift targets. I saw 2 planes knocked down by our ship's fire, and crewmen claimed hitting 2 others. The day's catastrophe might have been prevented if the whole fleet had moved out as Shigure had done, but no other ships got out that day. My own Samidar and Shiratsuyu were not at Rabaul, having left the previous day for overhaul by repair ship Akashi at Truk. We returned to harbour around 1000, and I was stunned at what had happened in less than an hour. I recalled grimly the debacle of January 1942, when American planes had damaged cruiser Miyoko at Malalag Bay. And here we were, almost 2 years later, pulling the same blunder. What a disgrace! Flagship Otago was burning, and her sisters Maya and Takao were damaged. These 3 heavy cruisers, each packing the firepower of a squadron of destroyers, were disabled in one raid, after having been conserved for a full year without ever engaging the enemy on the high seas. Also damaged were heavy cruisers Mogami and Chikuma, and light cruisers Agano and Noshiro, as well as destroyers Fujinami and Amagiri. I rubbed my eyes and wondered if this could be real. It was all too real. At Rabaul headquarters, the ordinarily mild Kusaka was furious. He bellowed imprecations at everyone. Meanwhile, Rabaul airfields buzzed like a stirred-up hornet's nest. Every possible plane was airborne in pursuit of the attackers. About 100 Japanese fighters and bombers finally succeeded in locating the enemy task force, distant some 235 miles on a bearing of 145 degrees from Rabaul. They reported sinking 1 large carrier, 2 cruisers, and 1 destroyer, in addition to damaging 1 medium carrier. This claim proved to be totally exaggerated. When a man is tottering, it is impossible to remain cool and objective. Objective double-checking of war claims is possible only when one is winning, so these illusions went into the official record unchecked, as had so many before them. Admiral Kusaka, who survived the war, explained, "I was sceptical of these claims, as of Japanese claims generally at this time, knowing full well the marked drop in the skill of our pilots during the past year. But to question the claims, or request verifications, would simply have frustrated the men, who were doing the best they could." The next day, November 6th, cruisers Otago, Takao, and Mogami limped out of Rabaul for Truk, escorted by uninjured Suzuya and Chikuma, which had suffered only superficial damage. It was sickening to watch the departure of these 5 cruisers, when one considered that their sortie probably was the most fruitless of the entire war. Only 3 days earlier I had been distressed at the departure of 2 crippled cruisers and my 2 destroyers. 1 heavy cruiser, Maya, remained in the harbour. Her vitals were destroyed. Light cruiser Agano, nearby, was barely afloat. The futility of our losses and the stupidity of our high command struck me forcibly, and I cursed aloud while wondering what Japan could do. At noon that day, I was summoned to headquarters, where Admiral Samejima greeted me glumly and said, "I want you to take Shigure and Yubari, which is the only operable cruiser we have, on a mission tonight. The situation is bad. We may be forced to give up Bougainville, but we must hang on to the nearby base of Buka. It has been decided to reinforce the defences at Buka." The decision did not surprise me. I saluted and turned to go, but Samejima called me back. "I must also tell you, Hara, that this will be your last assignment in my command. I hate the idea of having you go, especially at this time, but Shigure is badly in need of dry dock repairs, and you are entitled to a rest." Buka is closest to Rabaul of all the Solomon Islands. Shigure and Yubari crept to its coast that night and landed 700 troops of the 17th Army Division and 25 tons of supplies. Throughout this brief operation, tension ran high in both ships. There was no opposition to our landings, but we returned exhausted to Rabaul the next day. I reported to headquarters and said goodbye to Admiral Samejima. Our assignment turned out to be very easy, but, I cautioned, the next one like it will not be easy. Repeated tactics always seem to backfire. Samejima nodded and said, I appreciate your warning and will pass it on to other ships making the same mission. I am really going to miss you, Hara. We have lost so many experienced officers and men. I certainly want you to come back." In conclusion, he asked me to alter my schedule to allow for a slight detour. The detour involved a stop at Kavieng, New Ireland, with 2 transports Shigure was to escort to Truk. He explained unhappily that Rabaul, after the November debacle, was so short of ships that even poor Shigure had to be pressed into service on her way home for overhaul. The mission appeared much easier than any I had had in recent months, and I accepted it cheerfully. Shigure left Rabaul at 05:30 on November 7th with transports on Takasan Maru and Tokyo Maru. As day dawned, I gazed at the towering volcanoes behind the port. Rabaul was a drab and dreary place, but having been based there since July, I had developed a deep feeling for the place without realizing it. There was nothing attractive about Rabaul, but when we sorted, we always hoped desperately to return. Now we were leaving for home and would probably never see Rabaul again. In 3 brief months we had lost island after island in the Solomons group, until only Buka remained in Japanese hands. Buka might fall any day, and then Rabaul would fall too. We did not talk of this possibility, but everyone was aware of it. I thought of many friends who had perished in the savage battles in this area, and also of the many others who were staying behind, and tears came to my eyes. Looking around, I saw that my feelings were shared by others in Shigure. Men on deck waved frantically at the few standing watch in ships we passed on our way out. From somewhere came the lilting tune, "Saraba Rabauru yo, Matakuru Madwa. Farewell, Rabaul, see you soon again." This sad song had become a hit all over the Pacific in a very short time, though no one knew just where it had started. We reached the open sea quickly. The day was bright and sunny, the water calm. Everything was as pleasant as a holiday cruise. Enjoying the fresh breeze on the bridge, my thoughts turned to my many missions and sorties while based at Rabaul. My arrival at Truk on March 21st, and that day's revealing talk with Admiral Kondo had made me realize some of the many difficult problems which faced us. 2 of the biggest problems were the enemy's radar-controlled gunfire and skip bombing. It was with satisfaction at having whipped the first problem that I considered my encounters with radar-controlled gunfire from enemy ships, and how Shigure was the only ship to come through this trying period without the loss of a single man. The other problem, how to deal with skip bombing, I had not solved. Many times Shigure had encountered enemy planes, but they had never tried to skip bomb her. I wondered what could be done against such an attack. At sunset, we were still navigating along the southwestern coast of New Ireland. It takes many hours to cover 250 miles when the pace is set by transports, whose cruising speed is 12 knots. The weather was fair and clear, and the sky twinkled with myriad stars as we entered Isabel Strait. The 3 ships were just turning east for Kavieng when the radio room reported undecipherable messages being sent from nearby, indicating that enemy planes were operating in our vicinity. The holiday cruise was over. I remembered how I had once foxed an attacking enemy bomber by an instant overboost from 12 to 28 knots. Such a ruse would not work with Shigure's tired engines. Moreover, Shigure had been alone on that mission. Now there were the transports to protect. I increased speed to 18 knots and ordered a smoke screen for our 2 charges, while every lookout scanned the skies. The transports ran desperately eastward at their top speed of 16 knots. I ordered a further build-up of speed as Shigure ran erratically in and out among the slow ships, billowing out rolling clouds of smoke. A lookout suddenly announced 2 planes, 50 degrees to starboard, and I saw them, definitely bombers, making directly for Shigure. I was thinking of my next move, grateful that the attackers were not striking at the transports. Then the planes had a sudden change of heart. They swung parallel to Shigure on a reciprocal course and disappeared far astern. As I wondered what they were up to, the lookout called, "Planes returning on port quarter." They were approaching steadily and flying low. I tensed at the realization that they were going to skip-bomb Shigure. At last, I was faced with the unsolved problem. In that same instant, a solution flashed to my mind, and I yelled at the top of my voice, "All guns prepare for anti-aircraft fire 150 degrees to port." Turning then to Lieutenant Tsukihara, the navigation officer, I said, "No zigzagging. We will follow a straight course." Shocked at my order, Tsukihara stammered, What, Captain? Aren't we even going to try to evade?" "I'll explain later. Do as I say." Shigure had built up speed to nearly 30 knots while the bombers were choosing their approach angle. All guns followed as the black monsters swooped in on us. They were only a few 100 feet away, and I could hear their engines as I gave the order to fire. Guns and machine guns responded instantly, and amid their deafening reports I heard Tsukihara scream, "Do we still go straight?" In that tense kill-or-be-killed moment, there was no explaining the reflex formula that had suddenly occurred to me. I simply shrieked, "Go straight!" Now, years after that memorable encounter, it is simple to explain. Enemy planes were known to approach close in, to minimum range, before making their drop in skip bombing. The apparent and logical evasive effort for a ship is to zigzag as violently as possible. But a zigzag movement slows a ship, and bombardiers figure on this slowdown in planning their bomb run. I was thinking, too, of Shigure's very slow response to helm and rudder. By eliminating the zigzag, we would not only speed up the ship, but also throw off the bomber's calculations. Another advantage to following a straight course is that the ship's guns can fire more accurately, as zigzagging disturbs their aim. With shrieking, spine-quivering sounds, the bombers flew past our masts from port to starboard, and 2 bombs fell. They skipped all right, but over the ship, missing their target by 7 or 8 meters, as Shigure roared along at full speed. The bombs exploded, shooting up 2 high columns of water as the planes banked and pulled away to the south. The gunners halted their barrage, but stood by to resume fire as necessary. An uneasy 5 minutes passed in which there was no sign of the planes. Then word came from the radio room. Enemy pilots are transmitting in plain language. Ensign Hiroshi Chosa, our English expert, jumped to his feet saying, "Okay, boys, I'm coming to hear what they have to say." And he darted from the bridge. A minute or 2 later, Chosa announced through the voice pipe, "One enemy plane reporting its controls are damaged, is giving its position in code. Another plane says its left wing is damaged and it is going to ditch." The bridge roared its jubilance. Tsukihara, who had been so greatly concerned, was literally leaping with joy. Chosa continued, "The enemy base replies that a flying boat is rushing to the rescue. The locations, unfortunately, are given in unreadable ciphers. Wait. The planes say, 'Thank you,' and they are now ditching." I sighed with relief. I had not expected my new formula to work with such telling effect. Shigure slowed down and rejoined the transports. We resumed our holiday cruise toward Kavieng, unloaded our consignments there, and departed for Truk early in the morning of November 8th. The holiday mood was again broken with the announcement at 1000 that Shigure's sonar gear was out. Our technicians worked all day but could not revive the sensitive, long-overworked system. With no sonar, it was most uncomfortable to recall that enemy submarines were known to be lurking in this vicinity. How could our deaf destroyer hope to protect the slow transports during a 3-day voyage? The submarines would certainly be out to avenge the bombers we had knocked down. I ordered an emergency setup with all depth charge men standing by. The 2 transports were told to spread out with a distance of 1,500 meters between them. Shigure took position to starboard. The holiday cruise had turned into a raw nerve run. Nothing happened during the rest of the day or night. The following day, a Tuesday, was also quiet. My crewmen were dead tired after their long watch, but if we could go one more day without incident, we would reach Truk safely. All Wednesday morning I carried out intense anti-submarine exercises. The weather was cloudy and the sea was getting choppy. At 11:30 I ordered a recess from the exercises. Just as the men spread out on deck to relax, I saw the telltale wake of a torpedo crossing in front of Shigure from starboard to port. Instead of reacting promptly, I stood for several seconds watching the track of the torpedo as it headed for Tokyo Maru, then some 700 meters ahead and on the port bow of Shigure. The torpedo caught Tokyo Maru smack amidship. The shock of the explosion was felt in Shigure, and it brought me to my senses. I called for fighting speed, 24 knots, ordered depth chargers to stand by, and sent Shigure racing down the track of the torpedo wake toward its source. We launched 6 charges, but no results were observed. The submarine had gotten away. Not surprising, I thought, with a skipper clever enough to score with just 1 torpedo. I stood stunned and angry on the bridge. My sluggish reaction had let the submarine escape. Shigure kept circling the transports, but the sub did not come back for a finishing attack. There was no fire in Tokyo Maru, but her engine room was filling with water through the gaping hole in her side. She was still able to stay afloat, but had no power. Accordingly, Ontake-san Maru took her in tow, and we headed again toward Truk at 7 knots. While our little convoy sailed on, Tokyo Maru's list increased steadily. After 8 hours it was clear that she was sinking, and her skipper ordered abandon ship. Shigure closed to receive her 70 men and officers just before the 6,486-ton transport slid beneath the waves. This was a sad occasion for me. It was the first time I had ever lost a transport under my escort. Had the attack come a few hours later, the freighter could have reached Truk, even in her damaged condition. But then, had the enemy sub used a few more torpedoes, Tokyo Maru would have sunk instantly. I took further solace in knowing that there were no casualties in her torpedoing or sinking, and her cargo had already been safely delivered to Kavieng. Shigure's score for this mission was 2 enemy bombers knocked down in exchange for 1 transport sunk, no casualties on either side. In monetary value, it may be figured that this was about even, but a big freighter meant much more to Japan in those days than the shooting down of 2 enemy bombers. I was provoked with the attacking submarine for many days whenever I thought about it. But now that years have passed, I would like to salute that submarine and her skipper for the skill of the approach, torpedo firing, and evasion in the attack on Tokyo Maru. I do not know if more than 1 torpedo was fired, but that was all I saw. The sub did a very good job. On that day, however, I could not look on the event with such detachment. Shigure and Ontake-san Maru reached Truk around noon of November 11th. I visited cruiser Atago, the 2nd Fleet flagship, a couple of hours later to make my uncomfortable report to Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. I also wanted to see his Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi. I still remembered vividly our conversation of 8 months earlier, in March, at this same base, and the many problems he had posed at that time. I now had answers to some of those problems. Atago had been damaged in the November 5th raid on Rabaul and was being repaired by factory ship Akashi. Everything on board was in turmoil. Staff officers were running around and would not even listen to my report. Kurita, they said, was tied up, and Koyanagi was with him. I finally got a word with Koyanagi by hailing him as he was going into the head. We shook hands, and he smiled, saying, "I'm glad to see you again, Hara." I quickly recounted my experience with the 2 bombers off Kavieng and my regrettable loss of Tokyo Maru.